Hey, welcome to Two Doctors Homestead. My name's Daniel, and I want to talk about bug-in tips, bug-in strategies, your disaster response plan. Have you laid it all out? And what are some areas you might want to think about, right? And the first 3 minutes of any disaster, whether it's a flood, a fire, war, whatever it is, there's all sorts of stuff that might happen now, especially now, with everything that's going on in the world. What do you do in the first 3 minutes? And I always say the first 3 minutes is medicine and oxygen, right? Can you breathe? And are there anyone with any injuries? So disaster happens, whether it's a fire or anything else. First 3 minutes, maybe even the first few seconds is appraise the situation. Are there any medical injuries you need to attend to? Are you in a safe spot? And can you breathe? Do you have a gas mask? Do you have a first aid kit? Types of things you might need immediately in the event of a disaster, right? And if you can bug in, right, if you're in a safe spot, minutes turn to hours. Is there fallout? Where you're at, was there a nuclear explosion, right? First couple minutes, you need to figure out what happened. Hey, loud boom. Whatever it was, right, is you need to appraise where you're at, appraise your situation. First couple minutes turn into hours. Can you bug in? Is there a fire, a flood? Do you have a basement? Also, not your fortification, but your shelter, if you're in your house, at work, wherever you're at. Any windows broken, anything exposed, if you're planning on staying there, if you're bugging in for a long period of time, do you need to seal any windows? Do you have tarps? Do you have plastic sheeting? Do you have tape? Do you have boards? Is your shelter compromised? Is there anything you can do in the first couple hours to start to reinforce your shelter, right? First 3 hours of any disaster situation. Once you've gone past minutes, is your shelter stable, right? If you're in the wintertime and you're in a blizzard, it's going to start getting really cold if there's a power outage, right? Maybe the disaster is a power outage. Do you have alternatives for heating, little buddy heaters, heating lamps, gas, propane heaters, anything like that, right? What is your shelter, right? First couple hours, evaluate your shelter, sleeping bags, anything like that, right? So you've got past the first few minutes of the disaster, you're in the first few hours of the disaster, you need to evaluate your shelter. Is it worth sticking around, or do you need to switch to bug out? And at any point during a disaster situation, especially if you're bugging in, you might find that you need to bug out. So that always has to be an option. You always want to be prepared in case you do need to bug out. So hours start to turn into days, right? Do you have communication options? Are you able to communicate? Do you have a group, right? Do you have a prearranged bug in, bug out plan? Can you communicate with them? Do you have any kind of GMRS radios or FRS radios? Are they in range? Do you have any radio at all? If there's a power outage, do you have a backup radio? Try to understand the situation, understand what's going on, but also communicate with other people in your group, in your family. Try to do some coordination, right? And then hours to days. Do you have defense options? Home defense, self-defense, any way to defend yourself, defend your house, defend your family. If you look at what happened in Venezuela, very quickly after even just a power outage, you started to see a lot of chaos. And in any disaster situation, you may see chaos, and you want to be able to see is, hey, am I prepared to defend myself depending on what's going on, right? It may not be necessary at all, but hours to days, you want to look at defense options. So within 3 days of a disaster, you've bugged in. Water is going to become very important. You want to drink water within 3 days. Few people can survive 3 days without water. If you know someone that's gone for, great. It's not the point. You need water, right? So do you have water storage? Do you have filtration? Do you have catchment? Water catchment option, right? Water filter doesn't do you any good if you don't have access to water, right? So you're going to want to have water stored up, whether it's 5-gallon jugs or just regular water bottles, whatever it is, water bob in the bathtub. You want to have water options ready to go, right? You don't want to just say, if there's disaster, I'm going to go ahead and fill up a 5-gallon bucket of water, I'll be good. You want to plan for about a gallon a day per person, but you need to have that water ready ahead of time. Certainly longer term, if you're going more than days, water catchment is important, or a pool or a creek or somewhere you're going to resupply. And when you start foraging for water, or really even water out of the sink after a disaster may not be safe to drink, that's when you talk about things like water filtration, even a Berkey or something else like that, especially if you're bugging in. Weight is not as big of a deal, but certainly within the first 3 days, you need to have your water sorted out, right? Another one is backup power options. If there's a power outage, you've got stuff in the refrigerator, potentially if you're at home or maybe even at work, they might have a mini fridge, or if you're planning on going to the grocery store to resupply, they have fridges there. Do you have backup power options? Be it solar is a good one, certainly a generator is another option. The disadvantage with generators is they require fuel. You may not have enough fuel to keep that long term, but in the short term, if you have a generator, you can run it for short periods of time. But within the first couple days, you're going to want to get that fridge cold again. You're going to want to get that freezer cold again. Save any food that's in there. If not, do you have a way to can it, right? If there's a blackout, do you have a pressure canner you can put on a fire pit and can that food? So first couple days, you're going to need to evaluate the food and anything that might spoil right away due to lack of power. And you may have backup power option. I like solar. I've done a bunch of videos on solar. Another thing to look at is sanitation. We did videos on a bucket toilet seat, right? If there's a power outage or some other disaster, your toilet might not work anymore. In fact, it could back up if you're on city sewer or something like that. So within a day or 2 days or 3 days, you're probably going to need to go to the bathroom, and you may need to have a backup option for sanitation, right? Next one looking at is cooking and cleaning. Once again, if your power's out, your stove might not work. Do you have backup options for cooking? Even like a camp stove that runs on propane, it's a good short-term option, right? And some options are short-term, some options are long-term, but you're going to need to have some kind of backup plan for cooking your food if the power goes out. Now you may have a gas stove and be like, hey, it doesn't affect me, and that's fine. There can be outages on gas stoves as well. But you have to look at your options, right? Look at what would happen if, right? The what if scenario on every one of your main options. So 3 days to weeks is what are your cooking options, and then cleaning options. Do you have extra cleaning supplies, especially if a disaster drags out? You may not be able to go to the store, and you're still going to need to wash your hands and shower and clean your pots and pans. Do you have extra backup soaps and dish soaps and stuff like that? You're going to need to cook, you're going to need to clean. And then lighting, rechargeable batteries, oil lamps, that kind of thing. Certainly if it's an EMP, you may not be able to use electricity, right? EMP attack could wipe out electricity. In that case, something like an oil lamp might be a good idea. You're going to want some kind of lighting, especially if you're bugged in, you're sitting in your house. You don't want to sit in the dark 24/7 hiding out. Some kind of lighting would be a good option if it's not an EMP. Solar power, rechargeable batteries is also a great option. But first couple days, lighting is a question, right? Do you have a way to light your area? As it goes from days to weeks, potentially, if it's a long disaster, you have to look at your situation, gray man, location, generator. If you're in an area that has power down and you're the only one on the block running a generator 24/7, that could draw a lot of attention. If there's been a nuclear blast and all the windows are blown out and you've got plywood on the outside of your windows, that could draw attention. So you might want to consider gray man approach. Is how much noise are you making? How fortified does your house look from the outside? Maybe you put the plywood on the inside of the windows instead of the outside of the windows, so it's not so obvious, right? If you have a generator, maybe think about a soundproof box, some way to cut back on the sound. You don't want to stand out as the only house in the neighborhood having a party when everyone else has been without power for weeks and maybe starving to death, and here you are smoking a brisket on the back porch, right? So you got to think about your footprint, and gray man's certainly a good term for that. Is how much are you standing out, and you want to probably minimize that as much as possible, certainly as you're talking days a week in any kind of a major disaster. So within the first 3 weeks, food preservation, pantry, do you have food stocked up? Certainly, hopefully, if you're a prepper, you have more than a couple days or even a couple weeks worth of food, and we spend a lot of time talking about emergency food options, right? You want to have a deep pantry to survive that kind of a situation. But once again, you need a way to cook it without making a high profile, right? Which might not be a campfire, right? You're going to want to have other options. I understand long term, if you go from weeks to months to years, there's not probably enough propane stashed away or anything like that, right? EMP or electricity is going to be out. At some point, we all resort to living in caves and cooking on campfires. But in the beginning, first couple weeks of a disaster, hopefully a disaster doesn't last more than a couple weeks, but you want to look at your food and how you're going to cook your food and what kind of options you have. But going from hours to days to weeks to months is fortifications. We talked about boards on the windows, maybe things like sandbags, certainly good for flooding and stopping bullets. But can you fortify? Is your position defensible, right? If we're at work and you bug in the office, is it defensible? If you're home, is it defensible? If you're in an apartment, is it defensible? Said especially going hours, days, weeks to months. Once again, we saw Venezuela, power went out, and it did not take long before you had full chaos, right? And people were robbing people in hospitals. So a defensible position, I think, is important. And if you're not, and you see riots or looting or something like that that could impact you personally, once again, you may need to pivot and bug out to somewhere safer. Bugging out should always be your option. But you got to think about short-term preps, once again, long-term preps, and how you're prepping and your process and your planning transitions days, weeks, months. So again, you may have a couple propane jugs, but once that runs out, what's your plan? And that's your plan A, plan B, plan C. You want to look at that on all your preps, your food. Hey, we got the generator, we're going to keep the freezer going. Maybe that's days, maybe that's weeks. But if you pass days, weeks into months, are you going to be able to can the food, right? Same thing with water. Hey, we've got 20 gallons of water stashed away. Great. When that runs out, what's your plan? Days, weeks to months. How do you communicate? We talked about communication, community. How do you bring your community together? Do you have a group? Do you have people? Do you have a plan with those people? If you can't communicate with those people, especially as time passes on, either building your community or having a community, where I'm at now, and most people do, you have neighbors, and if you have food supplies and they don't, how do you plan on interacting with that community? Once again, you want to go gray, but you might have people knocking on your door. You might have people kicking down your door. So having community and understanding the people around you and how you want to respond to that as time goes on, I think it should be part of your planning from the beginning, right? Set some ground rules for yourself. 3 months to a year. Weeks to months to years. How do you resupply, right? Even if you have a ton of food stashed away, eventually that's going to run out, right? And the most common ways to get food, garden is certainly an option. Can you grow a garden? Well, if there was a nuclear attack and there's fallout everywhere, it may be a lot more difficult to grow a garden, but there are options. And if you plan ahead for that, like moving away topsoil, right, or covering the ground early on before it happens, you want to limit the amount of fallout that gets to the ground. But if you're talking about bugging in for months, going into maybe years, growing food is certainly an option, right? You're going to need that food, and obviously you need the water. The moment you run out of water, it's game over. So water catchment, water resupply, digging a well if you don't already have one. But how are you going to resupply long term over the months? We said gardening, growing food, very important. Do you have the seeds you need, or do you plan on just magically finding the seeds months after a disaster? You probably need the seeds and the tool, and I'll be honest, gardening takes practice. You're probably, if you've never gardened before, don't plan on being great at it the first season, right? Try learning how to garden now, at least practice growing things from seeds, preparing the soil and whatnot. We've done a lot of videos on gardening. They don't seem super popular right now, but people need to get into that gardening mindset, especially if you're concerned or not concerned and happen to find yourself in a disaster situation that does drag on beyond your food supply. How are you going to garden? How are you going to produce your own food? Other ways to procure food certainly is livestock. We have chickens. Certainly we'd have to look at how we plan to feed those chickens long term. They're not magical food making machines. They are food making machines, but you still have to feed them. So if you have livestock or you plan to acquire livestock, you got to look at how you're going to feed those long term as well. And some of that goes back to gardening, growing things like buckwheat or whatnot. There's things you can grow pretty easily that grow well that you might be able to feed your livestock. But in terms of growing your own food, having your own livestock is a great option. The other option is hunting, right? If there's a disaster and it's been months without a grocery store, hunting is certainly an option. Keep in mind, during the Great Depression, a lot of people were hunting and fishing, and we nearly hunted all the deer to extinction. So hunting may not be a great option. It really depends on where you're at and the availability of game animals. Certainly if that's an option, go for it. Hunting and procuring food is going to be very important, right? Other options, tools, right? Another thing to look at, especially weeks to months to years. Tools. Do you know how to use tools? Can you repair your shelter? Can you repair a hole in the roof, right? Can you repair holes? Just fix things in general. Maybe you need to expand on your shelter, build a chicken coop. Having even some basic tools, hammers, nails, hand saws, drills, screwdrivers, basic home repair tools, building tools, things like that could make a huge difference, and not just for fortification, but just to be able to repair what you have or expand out. So do you have tools and the knowledge of how to use them? Basic carpentry, something like that. We had shown a book review, 5 books, I think it was, or 4 books for preppers. We did a 5 and a 4, and we looked at the chicken coop for dummies, and that actually provides a tutorial on basic carpentry skills that you might be interested in learning. And then finally, of course, bug out plan, bug out location. At any point in your bug in plan, you may find that you have to bug out. So you always want to have that in mind. Once again, plan with your community, with your group, where you're going to go. If something happens, where everyone's going to go and try to get to. And, in the case of an EMP or a disaster, you got to realize it might take days to get there. So individual people should have a get home plan or a bug out plan to to your location, or if you're going to someone else's location, you want to let them know ahead of time so you don't surprise them and just walk up to their house and say, hey, I'm bugging out here, right? We're going to bug in together here. You should work that out ahead of time. But also things like a fire, if it tears through the neighborhood. Said, as we've seen happen, fires can happen. Do you have a plan? Do you have your bug out plan? And do you have a bug out bags ready to go, and where you're going to go if you're going to bug out? I don't think you want to bug out without a location, a destination, unless you really have to, because at that point you're really just a refugee, right? You can only carry so many supplies with you, and eventually those are going to run out. So you're just sort of going out into the world hoping to find a better place with supplies. So I hope that helps out. Thank you for watching. We just want to get over the idea of bugging in and give you some ideas of what to think about, but we appreciate you.